Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 25th to 31st of January 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville. Before getting started, we would like to send a special shout out to our good friends at Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we will bring you updates on a carbon fiber rocket from CALT, on a bankruptcy announcement from the HNA Group, a very interesting article about rising stars in China's political hierarchy. But first, some information on Geely and the company's constellation plans.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Jean, would you like to get us started on the Geespace Geely constellation plans and the announcement this week on that?
Absolutely. So Geely, the automobile manufacturer in China, made the headlines over the past 2 years, notably because of its diversification into the space industry. And there's a satellite manufacturing component to that. There's also a constellation component to that. So my piece of news this week is mostly about the constellation part. And this week, we finally got some tangible information about how things are moving forward with this project. So in the local media, we got news this week that the Qingdao SCO Demonstration Zone, which is basically a high-profile industry zone, industrial zone in China, officially kicked off what is called the Qingdao Aerospace Science and Technology New Industry Project, which is a huge construction project over 20,000 square meters, and notably it will host the Qingdao Shanghe Aerospace Technology company. So just a little background on this company and how this is linked to Geely. Qingdao Shanghe Aerospace was founded in August 2020, according to the corporate database Chi-Cha-Cha, and it's fully owned by Geespace. So Geespace being the space industry branch of Geely, and that's based in Zhejiang. So digging a little bit into the background of this company, Qingdao Shanghe, you realize that it's quite well funded. It was registered in August 2020, so less than a year ago, with an initial capital of 100 billion RMB. Also, very interestingly, its scope of activity when it was registered included things like providing satellite comm services, providing satnav services, providing mobile satcom services, and also selling mobile satcom terminals and manufacturing them, and finally also smart automobile systems. So when you put all that together, you realize that this is very likely 99.9% really this constellation project of Geely taking shape. And I think that's the main takeaway here. It's that Geely, although there were doubts previously, now it seems that they definitely plan to deliver on this initial constellation project that would provide mobile satcom services and satnav services to the smart automobile industry. And this is sort of interconnected with a piece of news that we saw a couple weeks back, I think on January the 11th, where we saw Geely sign a cooperation agreement with Baidu being one of the leading companies in China for AI technology linked to autonomous driving, and also one of the leaders worldwide on this technology. So I think that's the main takeaway here, and more of a secondary takeaway. I think it's also interesting to see how yet another space company here is taking advantage of, making the most of provincial space initiatives. And so here it's the Qingdao SCO Demonstration Zone, which is an industrial zone that has very high level of support from central government. So I think it was kicked off in 2016, and just 2 years later in 2018, they announced that they would have 26 major projects, and accounting for 43.7 billion RMB. So yeah. Lots of updates from interesting updates from Geely this week. And so any thoughts on Geely?
Definitely an interesting example of cooperation between a very large Chinese company and a provincial government, or a city government in this case. So just a couple of quick points. I think for Geely, the interesting thing from my perspective, and we saw in March of 2020 some announcements about this, So Geely, the parent company is Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, so ZGHG. And Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, so they own, in addition to the Geely Automotive Manufacturer, which is one of China's largest private automobile manufacturers, they also own about 50% of Proton, which is a big Malaysian auto manufacturer. They also own a large percentage of Lotus, the UK manufacturer, and also Volvo, although it's only the consumer car manufacturer of Volvo, because Volvo also does some industrial vehicles. And then also they own about an 8% stake in Daimler, which is it's a huge auto manufacturer. And so Geely is, and they're the CEO, Li Shufu. He's a pretty eccentric billionaire. He's not an Elon Musk figure. I mean, it's always kind of asinine to compare anyone to Elon Musk in such a way. But digressing, he's a pretty visible Chinese billionaire, and he has publicly talked about his desire to kind of transition Geely and transform the company from being a manufacturer of automobiles to a manufacturer of autonomous cars, and then kind of an autonomous fleet operator type of company. And this is a similar thing to, it's somewhat similar to what we hear from Tesla as it relates to these vehicles becoming autonomous and then using Starlink to, have this connectivity worldwide, this sort of thing. This concept seems to be being pushed forward by Geely. And it's interesting, we saw last year when they were hiring quite aggressively for their facilities in Taizhou and in Zhejiang. Not only were they hiring positions for things like satellite manufacturing and sort of satellite design, this sort of thing, they were also hiring positions for like rocket scientist type people. And the implication is that they plan to have a fairly broad space program of just, satellite manufacturing and launch. And again, this is an interesting thing because this is a very large company. So Zhejiang Geely Holding Group, the parent company, their top line revenues in 2019, granted, would have been about 50 billion US. I don't know for 2020. We can check and get back to you on that. But certainly that's it's a company to keep an eye on because they do have a lot of resources. One last point that I would mention about Geely or Geespace, their satellite initiative, is that last year we heard quite a lot about Geespace recruiting rather aggressively from Space OK. Now, Space OK is a Chinese Academy of Sciences spinoff. It was one of the first commercial space companies in China. I think it was actually the third one. They were founded in 2014, and they have initially Space OK was hoping to do a constellation type of project based in Shanghai, and they've had some difficulty in getting traction there. And Geespace being based relatively near to Shanghai in Taizhou, Zhejiang, they apparently have recruited quite aggressively from Space OK. The former CEO is apparently heading up the Geespace team now. And so, it's and just one last point on this. I think that's an interesting example of, the private sector. Well, I guess in this case, it's a big private sector company trying to hire talent away from a smaller sort of CAS spinoff. But yeah, it's an interesting. It'll be one to watch, Geely. So, Jean, anything else on Geely, or would you like to take us to the CALT carbon fiber rocket engine design and the updates thereon?
Yeah, let's move on to CALT. So some activity also from in the state-owned companies as well. So CALT, so the Chinese Academy of Launch Technology, they announced that they had completed last week for the first time their 3.35 diameter carbon fiber composite cryogenic oxygen tank. And so this is quite a big news, notably because, first of all, the important point here, apart from carbon fiber, is that it's 3.35 meters. And this, as we know, is the diameter of the rockets of, basically of almost all the main workhorses of the Chinese Long March family, going from Long March 2, 3, 4, and also many others share this diameter for the rockets. And so the idea here is that, carbon fiber composites for cryogenic tanks is a very helpful technology. It's not a new idea. This idea was explored already 20 or 30 years ago, notably in the US by NASA and also other rocket manufacturers such as Boeing. And the idea is today, when you look at a fully fueled rocket, admittedly 90% of the weight of this rocket is fuel, and you have 10% of dry mass. But when you look at what this dry mass consists of, you realize that more than 50% of this dry mass is actually the fuel tanks. So the idea is, if you're trying to lower the weight of your structure and to gain in performance, definitely lowering the weight of your fuel tanks is a very good place to start. And historically, fuel tanks have been of aluminum, some sort of aluminum alloy, and it has been shown over the past decades that moving on to carbon fiber enables these tanks to drop in weight from anything between 25 to 40%. So a very significant drop. And when you take into account the fact that it's about 50 or 60% of the dry mass, and the dry mass is about 10% approximately of the fully fueled rocket, that gives us approximately 1 or 2% of reduction in terms of the weight of the entire rocket. And so on the CALT side, so they announced the following figures. They said that their new carbon fiber composite tank would be 30% lighter than the aluminum alloy one, dropping from a density of 2.8 grams per cubic centimeter all the way to 1.7. They also said that very likely the cost for such tanks could drop by 25% based on research they've been doing on how things have been done in other parts of the world. And also that potentially there could be a speed up also in the manufacturing cycles of these tanks due to the fact that there's just fewer processes when you're doing carbon composite compared to aluminum alloy. So a lot of exciting stuff. I guess we wouldn't be seeing this tank immediately like on the next Long March launch, because probably there'd be more testing, I would think, to make sure that this technology is mature enough to go on board a rocket. CFC, carbon fiber composite, it's a great technology. It does come also with its share of challenges, especially when you're at cryogenic temperatures where a lot of materials tend to become brittle. There's also the idea of having pure oxygen in contact with a carbon-based material. So there are a lot of potential challenges and also in manufacturing such big structures in carbon composite. But definitely an important step, an important milestone on making the Long March rockets more efficient and high performance.
Yeah, and I mean, not to sound like a complete ignoramus, but I was a little bit surprised to hear that such a large percentage of the rocket's mass was fuel and fuel tanks. So, I mean, it can sound incremental to say, oh yes, we can reduce the total rocket mass by like 1 or 2%, but that really opens the door to increasing the payload mass by like 25, 30, 40% or something. I mean, it's a huge increase if we consider that, as you said, we're reducing that dry mass by like 30 or 40% or something like this. So the dry mass just happens to be a very small piece of the total mass. So yeah, I mean, it seems like as someone who's not really a rocket person by trade, it seems like an interesting development for sure. Yeah. So I guess now moving on to our third story. So an update from Macro Polo. It's sort of a think tank covering the Chinese macroeconomy. So an update about some rising stars in China's political hierarchy. And the article is not a particularly space-focused article. It talks about maybe 15 or so Chinese Communist Party member politicians that have been promoted over the last year, usually into the position of Communist Party secretary of a specific province. And the idea behind the article was largely like this is sort of the new generation of let's say leaders who are between the ages of say 50 and 65, who are now being promoted under Xi Jinping to kind of help play out his agenda in all these different provinces. And one of the things that the article did mention that was quite relevant to space, however, was that 3 of these rising stars are former space industry people. And so the 3 people that were of note, so it was Yuan Jiazun, Xu Dazhe, and then also Zhang Guoqing. And so the one of these that I had heard of before and that we had mentioned before probably on this podcast is Xu Dazhe, who is formerly a rather high-level person within CNSA and also within CASIC. And he has since, he was the governor of Hunan province for a little while, and he has just, last year he was made party secretary of Hunan province, which is kind of a promotion. In the Chinese system, you have the government, you have the party, and you have the military, that all three kind of exist side by side. So he basically went from being the head of the government of this province to the head of the party of this province, and the party is somewhat higher. Digressing, Xu Dazhe, in his time in Hunan, he has worked to try to bring space industry activities to Hunan. So the most noteworthy from the perspective of Jean and I probably was the 2019 China Space Day Conference, which was in Changsha, and Xu Dazhe was one of the speakers there, Changsha being the capital of Hunan. But then you've also seen some space industry companies move into Hunan. So there's SpaceTube, there's Spacety, I believe CASC has had some activities there. So interesting to see Xu Dazhe continuing to move up the ladder. The second politician that was also noteworthy was Yuan Jiazun, who was a former VP of CASC, who has now become the Communist Party secretary of Zhejiang province, which is one of China's wealthiest provinces. This is also probably more interesting because Zhejiang has seen more space industry activity. So Zhejiang University, which is in Hangzhou, is one of the top space industry universities in China. It's one of the top universities in China. But then also, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, Geely, with their space efforts, is primarily focused in Taizhou, in Zhejiang province. So to have a former CASC person now as the party secretary of Zhejiang province should be quite significant. The final politician, Zhang Guoqing, was a former CEO of Northern Industries, so Norinco, which is more of a kind of defense contractor. They don't focus so much on space, but still, former Norinco CEO, who then went to be mayor of Chongqing, and finally is now promoted to party secretary of Liaoning province. And so just one last point to summarize, then I'll hand it off to Jean here, is we've heard over the last several years this kind of anecdotal saying that space industry high-level leaders make better politicians because the space industry is less corrupt. And I don't know how true this is, but the idea is if you cut corners and if you have corruption with rockets, it shows when the rocket blows up. Whereas, if you cut corners with some other industries, maybe you can get away with it for a while. And so the idea that just space industry leaders being a bit more accountable in theory. Also, I guess just being perceived as relatively cleaner because it's a bit more of an academic industry. This has led to, I think, space industry officials being seen as I guess, preferential for promotion within the party hierarchy. So definitely a pretty excellent article that just gives a little bit of insight more generally into how does China's hierarchy, the political hierarchy, work, and a bit of information on the role of space industry officials in that political hierarchy. Jean, anything from your side on the macro Polo piece?
I think it was a very helpful piece, reminding us that, I think we tend to focalize a lot on the top level leaders in China, Xi Jinping, obviously, but also the people that are just beneath him. But there's a lot of activity of importance that's going on at a provincial level. And so it's an interesting article in that regard. And it's also interesting to see how these officials are selected, promoted to these positions, and also, more interestingly, how they move around. I mean, we were discussing this with Blaine, you just now earlier, how politicians in the US, but also in France, tend to have a very strong local anchorage in a certain area of the country, whereas in China, they're really moved around. You can be moved from a very northern province all the way to the southwestern provinces. And I think even Xi Jinping, for example, in his career before leading the country, he was at some point leading the province of, I think it was Zhejiang, and previously there was also Fujian for over 15 years, as well as I think for some time Hebei as well. So really moving from the north to the south and to central China. So I think that's also an interesting point to note here. And last point is, I think it's also a great article mentioning how we have more space industry people at a provincial level leadership. And I'd be very interested to see how this will impact, the space industry locally in a couple of years. And And speaking of, one province that has quite a strong space, at least a growing space industry, is Hainan province. This time, not really mentioning space. Our next piece of news here is about HNA Group or Hainan Group this week that entered bankruptcy restructuring. So for some of our listeners who don't know who HNA Group is a very, very large company. It was founded in the 90s. Its core activity was historically, it's been aviation. There was a company, the core initial company was Hainan Airlines, actually, one of the largest airlines in China today. And up to very recently, it was a Fortune 500 company. And today it has stakes in over 14 airlines. It has activities, in tourism, in the food industry, in the real estate industry, and in so many industries that sometimes I feel question is more, what does Hainan Group not do? And I think Hainan Group is actually really emblematic of a period between 2015 and 2017 where Chinese companies went on a shopping spree, or at least some of them. What happened back then overall is that in 2015 we had the Chinese authorities lower or relax restrictions regarding outbound investment, and some Chinese companies such as HNA Group, but there are also others, took advantage of this policy to really just invest in any assets they could get their hands on. And so in the case of HNA Group, there were a lot of big names. And just to take a few examples, we had stakes in the Hilton hotels, also in Deutsche Bank, one of the largest banks in Germany. We had also Ingram Micro. So many companies. And what happened was in 2017, the authorities realized that this was starting to create a problem because, first of all, we had a negative outflow of renminbi, which was impacting the country. And secondly, there was these large companies that were creating colossal amounts of debt. And this was starting to be a problem. And just to give a few figures to highlight how far these companies went, HNA Group, for example, in 2017, it was reported that they had invested in over 1 trillion, that is not 1 billion, 1 trillion RMB of assets. They had created 500 billion RMB of debt, and they had stakes in over 2,300 companies. It's really, I don't know how you can manage a company that's that big. And so what happened was, due to this change of policy in 2017, they came under strong scrutiny from the government. They started to have to sell also a lot of their assets to pay back a lot of the debt they created. And in 2020, this has been going on. There was a working group that was created to see how HNA Group could move forward and honor its debts. But as we know, 2020 hasn't been very kind to a lot of companies, especially companies in the with activities in the aviation sector. And so apparently the working group this month was not able to work out, after 1 year of work, how this could be solved. And that's why HNA Group entered bankruptcy restructuring. And so I think what will happen very likely is, and this is what it's being said on the Chinese media here, is that we won't see a liquidation of the company. This is more, such a big company and that has such importance for the Hainan province that very likely it'll be, as mentioned, it'll be a restructuring. We'll probably have new shareholders. We also saw that Chen Feng, the historical founder, has stepped down from the company this month. And probably the company will focus on some of its core historical activities, aviation definitely being one of them.
Yeah, and it takes me back to I guess April of 2019. I went to Haikou, and so the capital of Hainan province, and you're in downtown Haikou, and you have there's the provincial government building that looks like every other provincial government building in China, just a very big kind of rectangular building. And then there's the provincial hotel, like the Hainan, guest house, whatever it is. And then there's just right across from that is the HNA Group World Headquarters. And it's just all in a row. And it's like, well, it's good to know that they're right down the block from the provincial government. But yeah, certainly I think a couple of interesting points that give a little bit more insight into the Chinese macro economy as a whole. So to your point about that period in, say, 2015 to 2017, where there was this massive outbound flow of investment, I think 2 points about that. So one, the reasons or the factors enabling that outbound flow. So you have a situation in China where Most investors cannot easily move money outside of China. There's capital controls on how much you can move out in a given year. And then even once you do move money out of China, it's not so easy to invest it into investable assets. Like it's not, if you're a Chinese person, it's not so straightforward to just open up a US brokerage account and transfer money from China and start buying US stocks. That's not really how it works, as it were. And so you had a period of time in like 2015 to 2017 where a handful of asset managers that were big conglomerates, so H&A, Ambang, a couple of others, they were able to raise a lot of capital from Chinese investors and take this money and go out of China and buy things. And to Jean's point, it led to a huge amount of debt, part of the reason being that they were probably overpaying for a lot of these things. And this is what brings me to my second point about this kind of the H&A group going out and buying all these things, is that it kind of throws you back to, I can't say I was there, but I've heard about it. The period in the 1980s when Japan was doing the same thing, where you had Japanese companies going and buying the Madison Square Garden maybe, or some historic buildings in New York City, this kind of thing, and massively overpaying for them. And I think it was H&A Group, although it may have been Ambang that bought the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City for something like $2 billion US, or just some insane amount of money. And so I think after a few years of that, ending in about 2018, several of these companies were just, as Jean said, left with these massive debt hangovers and these assets that were fine assets, but a lot of them had been, significantly overpaid for. And so, this is kind of, we're seeing the results of that. I think the timing is a little bit surprising because in 2020, we have seen a large increase in travel to Hainan. I mean, all of the Chinese travelers that would have otherwise gone to Thailand or to, Malaysia or some other kind of tropical destination, they were forced to stay domestic. And Hainan is the sort of Hawaii of China. The timing is a little bit surprising, but overall, the final result is one that was probably a long time coming. So, anything else, John, from your side on the H&A group?
Yeah, it's just one last thing. It's true that for me, it's a bit sad that this is happening to H&A Group in the sense that Hainan Airlines in the aviation industry is quite a respected Chinese airline that has very good service, that has good management. Yeah, basically has very good ranking. So it's sad to see that the core activity, one of the core activities in the historical activities, actually well managed and doing well, but it's this massive accumulation of debt and maybe sort of senseless accumulation of assets that have brought the company down. So hope that they get that sorted out in 2021 and that things will get better.
And one last anecdote to leave the listeners on, to your point about Hainan being a pretty good airline. So my mom and grandmother took a flight over to China in 2017, and Hainan had just started a direct Chicago to Beijing flight. And they booked for like $450 US. It was like Chicago to Beijing to Hong Kong and then back Beijing to Chicago, return. And they were like, the flight from Chicago to Beijing, brand new Dreamliner and nice drink menu. They had different kind of like Mai Tais and pina coladas and whatever else. Full service, all really, really good. And my mom and grandma were sold at that point on China. They were like, wow, this is great stuff. So we wish Hainan Airlines the best in their restructuring. And, the next time I'm at Haikou, I'll have to see if their headquarters is still in such prime real estate. They may have been taken over by the Hainan coconut juice manufacturing company, because that is the other ubiquitous export from Hainan province, is the little black pouches with the yellow font of the Hainan coconut juice. And I'm going to have to go and see if I can find one right now in Vegas sometime on my Sunday. So that being said, this is the last Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup being done by me from Las Vegas. I will be back in my more normal abode next week with better sound quality. And in a few weeks, I will be joining you from my real home of Hong Kong. So that being said, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup for the week of January 25th to 31st. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next week.
Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye.